morning everyone. Thanks again for joining this morning. I know it's very early, and if you're in Edinburgh, quite a stormy morning. So, but yeah, just in case you haven't, sorry, I'll just admit a few folks. If you haven't been along before, 5things is a morning meetup where 3 speakers share 5 key takeaways from one of their favorite non-fiction books. So I'll hope you leave this hour either a bit smarter, 83% specifically, as Philip has promised, inspired to pick up one of the books we talk about today, or just feeling a bit spot happier about stuff. A spot of housekeeping: this event is being recorded, but you won't appear on the recording unless you contribute, so hope that's okay. And please stay muted whilst the speakers are on, that'd be great. We'll hopefully have around 20 minutes at the end to ask the speakers some questions. So if any questions arise, just pop them straight in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. Just a reminder that the speakers aren't necessarily subject matters on this. This is about their personal experience of the book. So, and last time on 5 things, Christian shared his 5 things on how bad are bananas, and turns out bananas are kind of okay actually, but other stuff is definitely not. That's my summary of his wonderful talk. Sael gave us a fascinating insight into attachment theory and challenged us all to go and find our attachment style. And Emily gave us a reminder of why human connection is so important. Every 5 things is recorded, so you can catch up anytime via YouTube. I'll pop the link in the chat at some point. So this is the 18th 5 things. We've explored we will have explored 54 books by the end of this event, which is 270 things, which is more than my brain can hold, definitely. But I've had some truly wonderful speakers along the way. And as always, I'd like to add 3 new speakers to this esteemed group. So we will say hey to Andrew, Philip, and Rita. Hi, Andrew, Philip, and Rita. And they're saying hi back. This is wonderful. And we'll kick off first with Andrew. Andrew is originally from San Diego, California, but for some reason chose to settle down in chilly Scotland, or Edinburgh specifically. I'm unsure. It always confuses me why people choose that. Why it's a very beautiful city. Anyway, and Andrew's product manager at Sit Now. When he gets some free time, his priorities are in order: playing with his 2-year-old son and doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu, swimming, reading, and writing. And Andrew's going to share 5 things from Triumphs of Experience by George E. Valiant.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andy. When I was young, I really wanted to apply to Harvard University. I grew up obviously in America, and I thought anybody that went to Harvard would be able to have these instant riches, power, wealth, fame, and that they had a shortcut to success that normal people don't have access to. My mother stopped me from applying because she didn't want me to be part of what she considered to be an old boys network. I don't know that I would have ever gotten in, but I always felt like she stopped me from being as successful as I could be. About 15 years later, I read an article about this book, Triumphs of Experience, which is about something called the Harvard Grant Study. When I learned about it, I thought that it could be my chance to learn about those secrets that you would only get with a Harvard or an elite education. The reason I thought that was the grant study started in 1942, and the entire point of the study was to figure out something they called the antecedents to flourishing, basically what makes some people successful and other people not successful. They took 268 Harvard students and followed them for the rest of their lives. It's still going on. Some of these men are 100 years old. They interviewed them at the beginning of the study, and then every few years thereafter, they interviewed their parents, their siblings, their spouses, their children. They sent them questionnaires every few years. They did mental and physical health examinations of all of these men. And they tried to figure out what led to some of them being successful and others of them not being successful. The point of Triumphs of Experience, the book, is after 80 years of doing this study, what have they learned about success and what they call flourishing. They understood that many of these men were privileged, or the author, George Valiant, understood that they're looking at a very privileged population. So what he also did was he compared the men of the Grant study to a study of inner city men from Boston. So the same area, just very, very poor. A study of women from Stanford. They studied the Lothian, or he referenced the Lothian birth cohort here in Edinburgh, and other studies that are similar from around the world that tracked people from a certain age, like their youth, all the way to old age. And he took lessons from all of these sources. So my 5 things are 5 of the key lessons for flourishing. Andy, you can go 2 forward, I think. Yeah, so number 5 was living gracefully to 90. And the lesson here is that if you want to live gracefully to 90, you need to be mentally and physically fit at different times. So what that means, there's 2 different factors. Oh, my watch alarm is going off. I apologize. There's 2 different factors at different points of life that lead to flourishing. Before the age of 55, mental health is critical. So things that have a significant impact on mental health include mood-altering drugs, I should say a significant negative impact, mood-altering drugs, a bleak childhood, which we'll talk about in a little bit, poor relationships, especially with parents, major depression, immature defenses, so basically the way that we react to bad situations, and poor life adjustment. So with those 6 things, people with mental health challenges die at a much higher rate before the age of 55 than people that don't have these things. Some of them are you can't avoid, such as a bleak childhood or poor relationships with parents. You can improve them. Sometimes depression is clinical, but things like mood-altering drugs you can avoid. And you can work on life adjustment. But those mental health challenges tend to do their damage before the age of 55. And then after the age of 55, the things that negatively impact life were smoking, alcohol abuse, which is one of the 5 things that I took away, and we'll talk about later, hypertension, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. 5 different factors that after the age of 55 have a really negative impact on life. Surprisingly, there were 2 things that didn't have any impact on life after 55, cholesterol and exercise. They found no impact whatsoever on people's lives. So the takeaways from this one, how to live gracefully to 90, are that some of these things can be avoided and that it's possible to avoid drugs, smoking, alcohol abuse, and obesity. So we just need to do that while focusing on things that improve our mental health. So that was the first one. The next lesson, problems don't lead to alcoholism. Alcoholism leads to problems. In society and oftentimes in science, we have this idea that people start drinking because they have problems, and then the drinking becomes a problem, and that leads to alcoholism. What the study found was that over the course of these men's lives, it was actually the opposite. They defined alcoholism as alcohol abuse or alcohol dependence. So social drinking, they didn't find any problem with, and as far as impacting lives. But if someone is to say, start drinking in the morning or drink 750 milliliters of spirits a day, which a lot of these men did, that was a big problem, and that started the road to alcoholism. The things that they found had no correlation to alcoholism whatsoever, included bleak childhoods, childhood psychological problems, and psychological, personal, or family instability. So none of those factors impacted alcoholism. The 2 factors that did impact alcohol, or correlate to alcoholism, I should say, number 1, genetic factors. Genes played a huge role in creating alcoholism. And it didn't matter if the child lived, or the person lived with their alcoholic parent or not. If their parent was an alcoholic, they were more likely to be alcoholic. If they didn't have alcoholic genes and they lived with alcoholic parents, or they were adopted into an alcoholic family, that didn't correlate whatsoever with alcoholism. There was a heavy, heavy genetic component to alcoholism among these men. The second thing, which was sad, was that in English-speaking countries, especially America and Ireland, they found that the drinking culture led to alcoholism. There was a fascinating study at Yale about how culture impacts alcohol consumption. They found that it's not as prevalent in Mediterranean countries, and they think that people are just taught to drink differently. The study, though, to get back to this point, they found that alcoholism came before things like depression or antisocial behavior or sociopathic behavior. And it came before marriage problems. There was a sense that bad marriages led to alcoholism. They found, again, complete opposite. Men started drinking, became alcoholics, and then their marriage problems started. The takeaways for me, obviously with my accent and my background, I come from a culture that celebrates alcoholism, and you'll see that in movies that come from Hollywood. I also have a family history of alcoholism. So for me, it's best to avoid alcohol altogether and just not get anywhere near that. Also, they found that it was useful to tolerate alcoholism as a disease or treat it as a disease rather than a mental health condition. And so thinking about that from a public health perspective, I think is one of the key takeaways and number 2 on this list. Number 3, love is almost all you need. And this was really one of the core things towards the point of the study itself, the grant study, to discover the antecedents of flourishing. For the future success of children, the most important thing by far is that the children are raised in a loving home. They had something, there's this arbitrary idea of what success is. So they had something called the decathlon of flourishing. I'm not going to get into the 10 things that made up the decathlon, but they had things like being in a list of who's who in a community, the amount of money that they made, their networks, things like that. And so they tested all the aspects of these men's lives to see if they would fit into this decathlon of flourishing or not. If they had 5 or more of the aspects of the decathlon, that meant they were flourishing. If they didn't, it meant that they weren't. They tested things like IQ, the social class of the children's parents, the income of the children's parents, and they found that none of these things impacted flourishing later on in life. So just because a child's parents were rich or socially prominent didn't mean that the child would be or wouldn't be. Back in the 1930s and 40s, when this study started too, it wasn't just Nazi Germany that thought that a person's physique could impact their future and their abilities, that their head size and head shape would matter. It also was among elite American institutions that said, okay, we're going to study these things because we think if a man has a muscular build, he'll be a good military officer. None of these things correlated to success, and a lot of these men served in World War II, didn't correlate to military rank whatsoever. The key finding was that when a child came from a loving home and they had good relationships with their parents and their siblings, that was more important than anything else for the future success of the child, whether it was social prominence, income, life happiness. Parents needed to be loving and warm. That was strongly correlated with adult income and position. Mothers were critical had a critical impact on future income and the ability of these men to develop healthy defense mechanisms to negative situations. And warm relationships with fathers enhance the capacity for things like play, which they don't know how that worked, but when a child has a warm relationship with their father, they play more. Siblings, good relationship with siblings correlated massively with income. And again, what correlated with military rank at the end of World War II was a cohesive home atmosphere in childhood and warm relationships with their parents. The quote that I took out of this from the book was, "Our lives, when we are old, are the sum of all of our loves." And the greater that sum, the greater that life. So that love, almost all you need, and all you need to pass on. And as a parent, again, of a 2-year-old, that was really great to hear. The next point also was something that made me feel better about being a parent. What goes right in childhood is far more important than what goes wrong. We have this idea that bleak childhoods, abuse, things like that, will set the stage for children for the rest of their lives. And it's not true. The total sum of a childhood, whether it's remembered warmly or not, is what really matters. It also means that a home doesn't have to be perfect all the time. There's a lot of pressure on parents now to make things perfect for their children. It doesn't really matter. It does matter, but overall is what's more important. It's not just the every single moment that needs to be perfect. There's things like social disadvantage, abusive parents, physical weakness. Those things do impact a child's life, but they can be offset by love. The love a child experiences can help them overcome pretty much anything later in life. The father relationship especially was critical here. Children with warm relationships with their fathers ended up less anxious when they were older, and they had fewer mental and physical symptoms under stress. And they also said that they were more satisfied with life when they were 75. And the relationship with the mother didn't have any sort of impact on that or correlation. So again, it took a lot of pressure off of me as a parent to always be perfect. And it just lets me focus on making sure that my son feels loved. So that was number 4. Number 5, and this was possibly, this wasn't the one that Valiant emphasized the most, or the point that Valiant emphasized the most. But for me, it was one of the key takeaways, probably the key takeaway, and that's we're always growing. And what matters at one age may not matter at another. There's a sense among, at least in American culture, and he also cites several developmental psychology texts. The latest was 2010, I believe, that say that basically by the time we're 20 or 30, we stop developing in a lot of ways. For example, our personalities are set and we don't change much after that. And over the course of these men's lives, from 20 to 100, they found that it's absolutely not true. We are continuously developing. And it's not like when a caterpillar changes into a butterfly. We do change and grow throughout our lives, hopefully up to a wonderfully old age. And this brings me back to when I was applying for universities and feeling like I missed out by not applying to Harvard. I did always feel like I missed out on this great experience. And I thought that I remembered all of the people that I did know who went to Harvard or other elite schools. And some that were the men that were covered in this book. Some of them were successful, but a lot of them weren't. They were just normal human beings, and some of them were really, really messed up. They would be considered failures by any stretch of the imagination. There was one guy that I knew who went to Harvard. He was a real successful politician, and he got caught up in this massive, really embarrassing scandal. And it's all of these people are just human beings. They're like all of us. And education, the Harvard experience, whatever it was, it's just a tiny part of our lives. So when we grow and when we age, that growth is what really matters. And we all have an entire lifetime to grow and to develop and to change. There was one other lesson that I can't cover because this is, again, 5 things, and a lot of small lessons from the book. If you want to know, you're going to have to read it and find out. But I do really highly recommend this incredibly interesting book. It was a really, really wonderful read. So thank you very much.
It was wonderful, Andrew. Thanks so much. Round of applause for Andrew. I'm sure you can feel that applause coming through the through the internet. I've got a ton of questions. That was wonderful, Andrew. Thanks so much. But we will move swiftly on to our second speaker of the day and a very different topic. That's what makes it all the more fun. So I'm just going to reload the presentation. Okay, so our next speaker today is Philip. He is an idea-energized, purpose-driven and goal-focused creative leader. He's also managing partner at creative powerhouse Whitespace and has played a key role in developing them into one of Scotland's leading creative agencies, if not Scotland's leading creative agency. It's up for debate. And I was dabbling with digital and brand strategies for these huge global brands on the side. I would say your main focus is now on improving your piano playing. Is that fair enough to say? Yeah, and competing in the British Triathlon at the World Duathlon Championships. Philip's going to share the best bits of architectural guru Frank Gehry's biography, Building Art, the life and work of Frank Gehry, by Paul Goldberger. Philip.
Cool. Thank you very much, Andy. And I'm sorry, I hadn't provided my 5 things to put in the deck. So that's why Andy has not completed this slide, because he was doing it in the background a minute ago. So that is all my fault, not Andy's. And thank you, Andy, for inviting me today, and lovely to see people that I know here as well. So a few caveats. Firstly, this is not an accurate summary of this book. I am not an AI. The whole value I am bringing is actually to tell my story and my interpretation of this book. It's not even a recommendation of the book. I don't think it's a brilliant book, actually. It's quite long, it's quite detailed, but I think it was really inspiring to me in terms of the things I'm going to share with you. So I'm not necessarily going to say go and read it. But do admire the work of Frank Gehry, and we're going to dig into a little bit of that. Trust none of the facts I talk about, but do believe everything I share. So they're my caveats. In terms of the reason why I read this book, I'd read an article in a newspaper several years ago about Frank Gehry. It was only like a 2-page or something. And the summary story I took out at that point was that in middle age, about somewhere in his early 40s, he downsized his architecture studio, binned a few clients who were doing really boring developments and focused on more creative stuff. And I thought, well, hold on a minute, I'm kind of in that same business, and if I want to create great work, what is it I should be doing? Then I read the book, and that wasn't really the story at all. It turns out that architects on the whole tend to get well known as they get older, because it takes a long time to build a portfolio. So look at that, Andy, it's so impressive in the background, jazz hands. So I thought, I'm 45 at this point, hopefully I'll be working a long time. What can I learn from this great man who's great? Well, actually, great creative person. Maybe he wasn't a great man. Let's dig in and find out. So first of my 5 themes is there's no age limit on creativity. Clearly, that was the reason I bought the book to start with. And that's the reason why I read it. And the book absolutely evidenced that. So Frank Gehry is primarily known as an architect. You may know him for the Guggenheim Bilbao and other buildings. That's probably his starter, his kind of entry. He's still alive. He's 92, and Bilbao opened when he was 68. So this is relatively old. And he didn't stop working at this point. The first building he ever built in New York City, he's based in LA. The first building he built in New York City was the ICA building for a corporate client, and was when he was 78. His first skyscraper, which is New York by Gehry downtown in Manhattan, was when he was 82. And actually, he opened an exhibition of new fish sculptures at the Larry Gagosian Gallery in LA when he was 91. So that was in 2020. So, he was still being creative. He was doing his best work later in life. What are the secrets? How did he make that happen? So let's dig in to point number 2. I think a lot of his success came through the power of relationships. So he was a real socializer in terms of dinner parties, really interested and curious about people. And he, early in his career, would do loads and loads of small jobs. Now, I think this is probably quite common with architecture. Obviously, someone isn't going to say, build me a humongous £100 million gallery for your first pitch, are they? But it all worked from him experimenting, trying, learning. And actually, before this, Andrew and I, we were all chatting before the event, and Andrew mentioned that the school he did end up going to was a Gehry building, and it was flawed in some ways, but it was also impressive. And obviously all the way through, he was learning and developing. And one of those small jobs then made a connection with someone within the Guggenheim, which then flew him to Bilbao before they'd even talked about architecture, and showed him a building they thought they were going to revamp. So a bit like Tate Modern or something, they were going to take an industrial building and then revamp it. And Gehry had a look at it and he said to them, it's not going to work. That space down by the river, that's brilliant. You should buy that and then build something new there. And then about 3 or 4 months later, the government figured out how to do that, and then he had the inside track because it was his vision, and he then won it. So being generous with his time, having those connections, and it was actually the building of Guggenheim that gave him credibility to build a project that had stalled for about 10-15 years, which was the Walt Disney Concert Hall in LA, which is also a very, very significant piece within his work. So yeah, really interesting that it's that power of relationships over long term. Next up is about being curious and don't worry about being an outsider. So Gehry, the guy who actually wrote this book, met Gehry for the first time in 1974 when Frank was 45. And the reason I'm wearing, I mean, I do frequently wear a t-shirt with a jacket on top, but I've gone for a very mild grey t-shirt and a jacket over top, which is very much what Gehry would wear. In the 70s, architects were swanky, Mad Men, suited shirts, and Gehry rocked up to this kind of annual conference, basically in jeans, a t-shirt and a jacket. And he started chatting to this newspaper guy who ended up writing this book. And he had no idea who he was. He didn't seem promising. He was just an outsider. He wasn't in the inside of the architecture world. And he tended instead to hang out with artists in LA. And the artists in LA were very much the ones who didn't want to be on the East Coast, big money, New York scene. You know, they weren't the Warhols or that kind of era of New York glamour party. They were the more fringe artists of the 60s and 70s that Gehry hung out with. And through that, he got loads of these contacts, but he also understood more about coming at things from an artistic and expressive perspective. And he also met loads of collaborators who were really important in his later life. So for example, Claes Oldenburg, the architect, designed a giant pair of binoculars that ended up being included within the Chiat Day building in the early 90s. Chiat Day being the ad agency that did all the famous work for Apple, really big LA ad agency. So he built these collaborations that was really, really important to how we saw architecture in a new way from an artistic perspective. The other thing, of course, it did is it made him appreciate what made a great art gallery. You know, why did he get the gig for the Guggenheim? Well, because he understood art, he understood the context that it needed to be in. The other thing he did is he worked with technology that wasn't used in the architecture sector. So he actually used aircraft design technology for managing the building at an economic scale for all these swoops and curves that are famous in this. So the ICA building in New York, his first real office building, was actually delivered at the same price as a boring cube, but it was swooping like the sails of a ship because he managed to use technology to deliver this at scale. All right, next up, number 4, find your fan club. So this is a little bit like the extension of the power of relationships earlier, and it connects in with the art community he was in. But ultimately, he was really good at finding people who loved his approach and then working with them. And often through the book, there's loads and loads of detail about every project, about different deals, about different ways that he got projects. But on the whole, he spent maybe 4 to 6, 8 hours with every new client, sharing his ideas, going out for a meal, just basically interviewing them and making sure that they had a collaborative connection. And fortunately, through the middle of his life, he managed to work with some very wealthy patrons, the kind of tech startup people in the 80s, early 90s, who had almost endless budgets for building their buildings, that allowed him to test and learn and really hone his skills. And he was really great at collaborating with these people. Number 5, bit of criticism here, be good. Now, I think one thing is be good at what you do, because then you become well known and other people want to work with you. But also this is because I don't think Frank was in some aspects of his life. We talked earlier, I think it was really great, Andrew, there's a commonality here with, actually Frank's 92, this was looking at kind of getting to 90 and, people who get there. I think the person who wrote the book was relatively sympathetic to Frank. He'd obviously had a relationship with him for a long time. He tried to be fair and balanced in the book, but I think that he tried to write nicely about some of the parts of his character that I don't think are that attractive, and certainly not something I would look to be. So work absolutely came first at the expense of lots of parts of his life. His first 2 children, he divorced his first wife. He didn't seem to have any functional relationship with whatsoever, which came to bite him later in life. He didn't do very well at managing his business at times. There wasn't particularly clear succession or leadership. He ended up falling out with quite a few of his kind of right-hand people or senior leaders through the business. He was still, when the book was written, which was about 4 or 5 years ago, still active and the leader of the business without a clear succession plan. I don't think he wasn't very good at making the tough decisions in his personal life or in his professional life. He was obviously so focused on the work and creating great work. He also pulled out of quite a few deals and opportunities along the way because he was stubbornly focused that he wanted to be seen as an architect, not an artist. So in the late 70s and early 80s, he designed some cardboard furniture. He designed some for his office, and then someone saw them. He got into a commercial deal with a manufacturing business. There was a huge launch. I think Macy's in New York, or maybe Bloomingdale's, one of them, had a partnership relationship with them. They did a huge advertising campaign, and then Gehry got cold feet and he just pulled out of it. And basically everyone else who had invested money lost lots of money. And, you know, this kind of thing, he kept getting nervous about things that might mean he wasn't an architect. And so I got to the end of the book and I got this real sense that, you know, he'd put work and craft first. And I was really curious about, you know, it seemed like he hadn't run a very good business. And I thought, I wonder, you know, what he's worth. Turns out he's the 4th richest architect of all time, worth $100 million. So clearly just being good got him through, but there were so many missteps along the way. So yeah, there we go. I think an inspiration to us all that you can do your best work as you get older. I think there are some learnings there in terms of that power of relationship. I'm not saying networking, but building, actually finding the people that inspire you, that make you the best, that help you make the best work along the way. The fan club, the relationships, taking inspiration from outside your area to bring something new, and try and be good along the way. Yeah, cool. Hope that was useful and interesting, and look forward to any questions at the end. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Philip. That was wonderful. Nice ending message, and be good along the way, children. That was great. Thanks so much, Philip. Again, I've got a ton of things I want to pick up on that, but we'll move on to our last talk of the day in another quite extreme pivot in talking in subject matter. But yeah, our last speaker of the day is Rita, and she's a PhD candidate and associate lecturer in publishing at Edinburgh Napier University. Her current research examines the structures of power in the periphery picture book publishing environments of Europe. I'd love to hear more about that sometime. And she also runs Coming Into View, a series of zine workshops for children of colour to find agency in their identities and comfort in their stories. And Rita is also a board member for researchers exploring inclusive youth literature, and co-founder of the Researcher Activist Network. So today, Rita is going to share 5 things from a book that I think has been particularly formative to her. I'm not sure if you'd agree, Rita. I think you've mentioned that in an email. Yeah, which is great. And that is White Tears, Brown Scars by Ruby Hamad.
Yeah.
Rita.
Thank you. So yeah, as Andy said, this was a book that was actually quite formative for me, despite being quite a recent read, because so essentially it is a book that it's a difficult read. Like, as you can see from the title, White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Betrays Women of Color. That's quite the accusation that is laid on the feet of white feminism, something that a lot of us associate with progressiveness. And I think what the book essentially does is it asks us to look at our daily lives and our activism, our beliefs, especially our progressive beliefs, and begs us to examine that in an intersectional lens. It says that we currently live in a post-colonial, capitalist, sexist, racist society that only gives the illusion of progressiveness for acceptable members of a marginalized society. And those illusions are used as weapons to further subdue or dehumanize everyone else who gets left behind. So just a bit of context before we move forward. White Tears, Brown Scars was written by Ruby Hamad. She is an Australian journalist and an academic who wrote the article for The Guardian called White Women, How White Women Use Strategic Tears to Silence Women of Color. And when she published that article, she received, the two poles, which is either a wave of solidarity from so many women of color who just saw their experiences within the article that she'd written, or white women who felt very attacked by what she was saying, that white tears were being used to silence women of color. Because essentially, I mean, it kind of is a thing that all of this comes from a good and well-meaning place. You don't get into activism to not help, but it's normally like how you help that sometimes could be more detrimental than it really is. Or because of the society or the systems that we currently exist in, your help could be weaponized actually to harm other groups. And to further that context, I am a Filipino who moved here to Scotland. Much like Andrew, I moved from a warm climate to, Scotland. And as a Filipino who moved to Scotland, I am someone who grew up not part of the minority, who became a person of color by moving to a predominantly white nation. And that has profoundly affected how I view my identity and how I live my daily life. I was a former journalist and I was a former publishing professional. Currently, I'm an academic, and my current research constantly has me theorizing parts of my identity for my research. And I guess that's how the book came to me, because I was thinking about the various parts of me that I am not conscious about. Because, I don't know who needs to hear this, but neither Ruby and I are white, shock and all. We're not white. And so when you look at the cover of the book, actually, with the headline, the blurb that's there says that this is a book that is a must for white women who see themselves as feminist. I see myself as feminist, but I'm not a white person. And Ruby Hamad is a feminist, but she is an Arab Australian woman. So for me, picking up this book, what does it do for me? Like, surely when people think that, like, oh, surely you're just preaching to the choir. Like, surely this is traumatizing for you to read these experiences. And surely it is just, like preaching to the choir, you already know this, you're just rehashing your trauma. Then what do you take from it? And that actually brings me to my first point, which is that we all have privilege. And I put there a quote that Ruby Hamad put, which describes what whiteness is. Whiteness isn't just your skin color. It is the various aspects of our privilege that actually mirror the white Western Europeans that created the system that we're currently in. And in the year of our Lord, or the year of our Audra Lord, 2022, this is a phrase that is often said, like, oh yeah, we all have privilege. I have privilege, you have privilege. But I think it's always worth coming back to the phrase and realizing just what our privileges are. Yes, I am a woman of color, and because of that, I am a marginalized member of society. But I grew up in a social economic background in the Philippines that actually afforded me a great education, that afforded me the chance to learn English in an American accent. The chance that afforded, if you look in my family history far enough, you will see that I am descended from Spanish colonizers who took land from indigenous people to prop up generations of my family. And it's not to say that my family are stinking rich. That is a story for another time, and money that was mismanaged by Victorian generations. But, that privilege exists within me, and it is what has made me into the person I am today. And in fact, I would even say that it is something that has enabled me to transition into a life here in Scotland without being as marginalized as some other people of color who immigrate to different countries. When I first moved to Scotland, I like to describe like my first, I would say 2 years in Scotland as me living my whitest life. And it was because people saw the whiteness in me, and that was my way in. I spoke English with a Western passing accent. I had a Western passing last name, because depending on like how you read it, it could be like seen as, oh, possibly French, or I don't know. If my dad is to be believed, then it was from some Dutch missionaries who came to the north of the Philippines, but I don't know how true that is. But yeah, so I have these various bits of my privilege that make me acceptable to a white majority. And I think once we start examining that, once we start examining what our whiteness is, and not just in the terms of like skin color, then we can actually see how we operate in society and why we are in the places of society that we are currently in. And then my next point coming into that is that it's not just about insert emotion here. So the title of the book is White Tears, Brown Scars, and it actually takes that, and the Guardian article takes from this exchange on our favorite Fox News. So it was when the violence, the white supremacist violence in Charlottesville had happened, and a panel on Fox News was discussing it, and one of the hosts, Melissa Francis, who I've depicted here, she started crying because she said, like, I'm not comfortable having this conversation. And she said that she was so afraid of being judged, of like whatever she was saying just being judged, because she believed in the president so much that she started crying. And it shut down the conversation for a good how many minutes. That channel was quiet for once. And I mean, sure, that's something to be thankful for, but at what cost? And it was up to one of her co-hosts, Harris Faulkner, who was a Black woman, to actually be the adult in the room and reassert, like, I know this is a difficult conversation, but it is a conversation we need to have. And when you think about it, like, this was an incident that was born from white supremacist violence in the Deep South. And the Black woman was stoic while the white woman was crying and shutting down the conversation. What was worse was the white woman was being comforted on screen while she cried her tears, which halted the conversation. Everyone was saying, like, oh, we just hate seeing you cry. But where was the concern for the Black woman? And I guess what I want to point out here is not just in terms of crying and stoicism, it's in terms of, and you see this in Hamad's book, it's in terms of the range of emotional capacity that women have as human beings. Sadness, grief, anger, joy, vulnerability, they are valid in white femininity, whereas they are suppressed in women of color. A Black woman can't be angry without becoming an angry Black woman. An Asian woman can't be assertive without being a dragon lady. A Latinx woman can't be passionate without being a sexy sex pot, a spicy sex pot. So I think the sooner that we start looking around in the room and looking beyond who can actually emote and who can actually show emotion, then the sooner we realize how pervasive racism is and how it is weaponized, even in environments that we see as progressive. And one of the ways that we can continue that is something that, again, is called at in within the margins or the between the lines of Hamad's book, which is to decenter yourself. Now, I think decentering, next slide. So yeah, to decenter yourself. So I think decentering is actually one of the best ways to start with your intersectionality. And I understand that sometimes we can think that it's slightly counterproductive. Like, how am I supposed to decenter myself when I actually have to constantly think about my privilege and what I am in this room as? And yes, you constantly have to think about yourself, but what White Scars invites you to do is actually think of yourself in relation to others and in your context in the wider world, how you operate in the wider world. Because one of the failings of white feminism in Hamad's book, one of the many failings, one of the other failings of white feminism in Hamad's book, is that sometimes it treats women of color as causes or pets. I mean, to paraphrase that old racist Rudyard Kipling, women of color are the white woman's burden. And Hamad's book is full of these really uncomfortable examples of white colonial women treating women of color as animals that need to be civilized. You know, these women of color saw themselves as bringing God into a godless land, or like bringing tenderness to the savage, or being virtue to the damned. They saw themselves as saviors, when unfortunately, what they were just doing was dehumanizing those that they wished to save. And that line of thinking, even though it's not phrased in that way anymore, is still very pervasive. Because I can't tell you like how many times I've done like talks on like, say, like race, intersectionality, activism, and various platforms, like say, like something like this that's informal or something that's more academic. And then afterwards be approached by a white woman to ask like, now, like, because now she's faced with her privilege. And then she asks me, what can I do? I have all of this privilege. What can I do? And as I said before, like it's coming from a very well-meaning place. But the thing that often leads that well-meaning place astray is the I of it all. In that sentence, it's like, what can I do? It centers you in a conversation that is actually about traumatized peoples. And when you ask someone, and I think that's another thing, like we have to start thinking about marginalized peoples as traumatized peoples. And when you go to someone who is traumatized, you don't say like, what can I do? What you ask is, what do you need? So by rephrasing that emotion of just like, from me to you, you can actually bring so much more to the table. And in fact, what you're also doing is you're giving someone a voice to actually say what the situation is like from their perspective and what the situation needs from their perspective as well. It displays the willingness and humility to actually listen. So now that you've listened, how do you move forward? Well, the flip side of women of color being the white woman's burden is white women being the woman of color's burden. And this speaks to something that Hamad also talked about within the book. It goes to the next slide. So it's something that, again, is not necessarily discussed very overtly, but I think is definitely there, like if you're reading hard enough, and it's white hesitancy. White hesitancy, I would argue, is the latest and greatest of the white supremacist arsenal, because it is the thing that makes you stop from actually acting. It's the thing that makes you feel uncomfortable about progressiveness or owning up to anything that you've done wrong. There is a reason why it's always white people who big up cancel culture or backlash. It's because if you get scared enough that there is a progressive mob out there who is out for your blood, then you'd be too scared to do anything. And because of that, usually people act one or two ways when confronted with the mistakes or their missteps, or someone, you know, providing them with information. Either one is that they double down their innocence, or they double down and they assert their innocence, or they cop out altogether. For the former, I've included here one of the things that Hamad talks about, which is when Mary Beard made this tweet about regarding the sexual abuse of sex workers in Haiti by staff members at Oxfam. And when she expressed her opinion about it, she used qualifiers like alleged, but also more painfully said that, oh, it must be difficult to sustain civilized values and still respect those around you that need help. And it's that use of the word civilized that scholars of color actually called her out on and said, that's actually like, you know, that there's some shades of colonialism in your words, Mary. Maybe just take notice of that. And she doubled down. She doubled down by saying things like, oh, I'm not a colonist. Like, I'm just like, I'm not a self-defined colonist. I'm an 80-something-year-old woman, and I'm just speaking from my heart. And both her and her defenders, the people who rallied with her, said that Mary Beard was just speaking from her heart. And in response, these uncharitable critics just bullied her into tears. Poor Mary, poor national treasure Mary Beard, Oxbridge scholar with a cushy tenure job, by the way. So what did that exchange do? It reasserted Mary Beard's innocence, because if she's crying, then surely it comes from a well-meaning place and she didn't mean to, without her actually owning up to anything that she did. But it also delegitimized the valid concerns of scholars of color who actually came from a point of view of knowing better and pointing out what was, the misstep in what Mary Beard had said. And again, that shows that constant thing that happens within white feminism, wherein women of color white women are comforted, while women of color are just like, you have to go on. What about the bullying that these women of color faced when Mary Beard's defenders started attacking their valid concerns? Where is the civility in that? And then the other way that people swing is that they cop out altogether and they leave activism to the marginalized, because and they say things like, oh, I don't know any better, it's not my place to speak there, or it's not my space. And I mean, to be fair, those two things are correct most of the time, and I say this for myself as well. You actually don't know any better, and most of the time it isn't your space to take. But is that really the excuse for inactivity? If it's not your space to take, then amplify other voices. That's what retweets are for. That's what platforming is for. Because there are marginalized people who have a voice or want to speak, and it could be, rather than take up the space and speak for them, I'll give them the space to speak to a wider audience. Or the other thing is like, oh, I don't know, then learn, but be guided by others. And that's, I mean, what this slide says, educate yourself and realize that you are in an environment of constant learning, but be guided by those who actually know better. Again, have that humility to actually say, like, I am still learning, and not necessarily tell me what to do, because then it falls again to burdening people of color with educating white people. But do the work. When you come in, be prepared to do the work, because know that it is necessary. And for the last bit, which is my final point, and I know I've gone on, so you're uncomfortable, what now? As I said, like, this book was a very uncomfortable read for me. I don't think I read it in one full-on thing. I had to take a break, because, I mean, it was difficult for me as a woman of color who saw my own experiences reflected in the book, but it was also difficult for me as a woman of color and as my own proximity to whiteness, because I know that I have a lot of proximity to whiteness, and it affords me so much protection in a world that, not a lot of other women of color would be afforded that. So you are uncomfortable because it means that there is something wrong. And what moving forward from that is asking, what do you do with this discomfort? Do you shut it down, or do you actually start having the difficult conversation? Welcome to my TED Talk. Thank you.
As Ace, thanks so much for that, Rita. I've got so many questions again. We have 2 minutes left. I could dig, but I think that's our biggest takeaway for me from that last talk, as a white guy sort of wading through a lot of these issues myself, but the reframing of what can I do to what do you need is really profound for me. So thanks for sharing that with me. I don't know what to do with the last 2 minutes. We could dig into so many so many things. I've got so many questions for you, Andrew, and Philip. But I think rather than delve into deeply into some of the topics that we explored today, we'll finish up, and maybe if you've got questions, I don't know if any of the speakers would mind sort of sharing some of their thoughts online on one of the many platforms that we can connect with people today. That'd be really helpful. But yeah, we'll finish up there for today so we can all get on with our work and all these other things, although I find it quite hard to work on a Wednesday after 5 things. I've got too much going on in my brain now, too many things I want to explore. So a last massive thanks to our speakers today. I really enjoyed today, really good talks. Really opened my mind in such a short period of time. And yeah, well, we'll do this again in March. So if you want to stay in touch, we've got a Twitter account at 5things without an I. And yeah, I really hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and hopefully maybe pick up one of the books that we talked about today as well, and continue growing your minds. Okay, folks. Well, thanks again for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye, folks. Bye-bye.
Oh no. Oh no.